the spring of 2009, a highly successful businessman in Mexico City was at the peak of his career. He was a partner to the famous celebrity Christian de la Fuente, and he lived a life of prestige, wealth, and apparent security. He had every reason to believe that his status protected him, or at the very least, that the rules of the city would be followed if things ever went wrong. He was exactly where he wanted to be. But instead of returning home after a brief disappearance, this man would be found lifeless in a dusty vacant lot, despite his family doing everything right. They had followed every instruction and paid a massive ransom in full, expecting the kidnappers to honor the unspoken agreement. The mystery is not just who took him, but why a professional crew would choose to break the criminal code and execute a witness who was worth far more to them alive. Tonight, I'm going to tell you 11 stories about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious in ways they never could have prepared for. But before we get into our first case, if you could please do me a huge favor. If you enjoy these stories, please offer to pay the like button's ransom in full and invite it into your car for a safe ride home. But the second it reaches for the door handle, I want you to lock the doors and drive away. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Now, let us get into our first story. The air in Mexico City during the month of May does not just hang around you. It feels heavy, like a wet wool blanket that has been soaked in diesel fumes and left to bake under the relentless high-altitude sun. It is a thick, shimmering haze that vibrates with the sound of millions of engines idling in gridlock. On this particular morning, the heat was already rising from the dark asphalt in wavy lines, distorting the view of the concrete skyline. If you stood still long enough, you could feel the grit of the city settling into your pores, a fine layer of gray dust that tasted like old pennies and burnt rubber. The noise was a constant, low-frequency thrum. It was the sound of tires grinding against stone and the distant, rhythmic honking of taxi drivers who had long ago lost their patience. Between the gusts of hot wind, there was a peculiar smell that belonged only to that part of the world. It was a mixture of spicy street food, rotting garbage, and the sweet, sickly scent of overripe tropical fruit being sold on the corners. It was an environment that demanded your attention, even if you had lived there for 40 years. The man at the center of this story was a 43-year-old entrepreneur who moved through this chaos with the practiced ease of someone who owned a piece of it. We will call him the partner. He was the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room, he occupied it. He wore tailored suits that resisted the humidity and carried a leather briefcase that held the future of multi-million-dollar media deals. To his colleagues, he was a shark, but to his family, he was a rock. He lived in a gated community where the grass was kept unnaturally green by an army of gardeners. He had a wife who still laughed at his jokes, and 2 children who looked up to him like he was a superhero. Every evening, he would sit at the head of a long mahogany table and tell stories about his day, making the complex world of international business sound like a series of small, manageable adventures. He felt untouchable, not because he was arrogant, but because he was careful. His routine was his armor. He believed that if he moved in a predictable, legal, and respectful way, the world would mirror that back to him. He was a man of his word, and he operated under the assumption that everyone else, even the people in the shadows, had a code they followed. He had no reason to think that 2009 would be any different from the years of success that had come before it. He was a man who trusted the system he had helped build. On the morning of the event, the partner woke up at exactly 6:15, just as the first sliver of gray light began to bleed through the heavy curtains of his bedroom. He didn't use an alarm because his body had been conditioned by 20 years of ambition. He sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 1 minute, rubbing his face and listening to the muffled sound of the city waking up in the distance. He then walked toward his private bathroom to start his day. The process of making his morning coffee was a ritual that he refused to outsource. He liked the physical sensation of the silver scoop dipping into the dark, oily beans. He liked the sound of the grinder, a sharp, mechanical shriek that cut through the silence of the house. He waited for the water to hit exactly 200 degrees before pouring it over the grounds. He watched the dark liquid bloom, breathing in the steam as it cleared the fog from his brain. While the coffee steeped, he spent 10 minutes standing by the kitchen window, watching the gardeners move across the lawn. He checked his watch, a heavy steel piece that had been a gift for closing his first major deal with Christian de la Fuente. It was a reminder of how far he had come. At 7 o'clock, he went back upstairs to dress. He chose a light blue shirt, starching the collar himself because he liked the way it felt crisp against his neck. He spent 5 minutes selecting a tie, settling on a deep burgundy silk. He tied the knot with a double Windsor, ensuring the dimple was perfectly centered. He then sat down to polish his shoes. He used a small horsehair brush, moving it in tight, circular motions until the black leather shone like glass. This was his time to think, to run through the meetings of the day, to prepare his arguments, and to settle his mind before stepping out into the world. By 8 o'clock, he was standing in the foyer, kissing his wife goodbye. He told her he would be home by 7 and that they should go out for dinner to celebrate the new contract. He picked up his keys, feeling the familiar weight of the heavy brass ring in his palm. He walked out to his car, a silver sedan that was armored but didn't look like it. He checked the perimeter of his driveway, a habit he had developed during the rise of the drug wars. Everything looked normal. The neighbor was walking his golden retriever, and a delivery truck was idling 3 houses down. The partner got into the driver's seat, adjusted the rearview mirror, and pressed the button to open the heavy iron gates of his estate. He drove slowly, waving to the security guard at the booth, a man he had known for 5 years. He turned onto the main road, merging into the flow of traffic that would take him toward the city center. The drive was supposed to take 45 minutes. He spent the first 15 listening to a business podcast, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel in time with the narrator's voice. He stopped at his usual gas station to pick up a newspaper, chatting briefly with the attendant about the local soccer scores. He got back into his car, buckled his seatbelt, and pulled back out onto the boulevard. It was a morning like 10,000 others he had lived through. As he approached a major intersection near the Polanco district, he noticed a black sport utility vehicle with heavily tinted windows idling in the left turn lane. It didn't strike him as odd at first, as there were thousands of vehicles like it in the city. But as the light turned green, the SUV didn't turn. Instead, it accelerated hard and swerved directly into his lane, forcing him to slam on his brakes. The sound of his tires screeching was loud and sudden. He sat there for a second, his heart rate spiking, waiting for the other driver to realize their mistake. He expected a wave of apology or a frustrated honk, but the doors of the black SUV didn't stay closed. Instead, they flew open with a violent force. 4 men dressed in dark tactical gear, their faces obscured by black balaclavas, poured out of the vehicle. They weren't moving like angry drivers. They were moving like a well-oiled military unit in a combat zone. One of the men carried a heavy sledgehammer, and before the partner could even reach for his phone, the man swung it with terrifying precision. The reinforced glass of the driver's side window didn't shatter into pieces, but it spiderwebbed violently, blinding the partner's view. He felt a wave of pure, cold adrenaline dump into his system. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He tried to shift into reverse, but it was too late. The men were at his door, screaming commands in a language that sounded harsh and distorted through their masks. He felt the door handle being ripped from the outside, and then the door was wrenched open. He was being grabbed by his collar and his belt, his body being dragged over the broken glass and onto the hot pavement. He tried to shout for help, but the sound of the city's traffic drowned him out. No one was stopping. No one was looking his way. The world suddenly narrowed down to the feeling of his face pressed against the rough, sun-baked asphalt. He could smell the burnt rubber from his own tires and the metallic scent of the car's exhaust. A heavy knee was pressed into the small of his back, pinning him down so he couldn't breathe. Then, a thick, black fabric was pulled over his head, plunging him into a terrifying, airless darkness. He felt his wrists being snapped together with plastic zip ties. The plastic bit into his skin, cutting off the circulation and making his fingers tingle. He was lifted off the ground by 2 men and thrown into the back of a vehicle. He landed on a cold metal floor that smelled of stale cigarettes and old blood. The door slammed shut with a heavy final thud, and the vehicle accelerated so fast he was tossed against the side panel. He lay there in the dark, his breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of the void. You are sitting in the back of that van. You can't see anything. Your hands are tied so tight you can't feel your thumbs. Every time the van turns, your body slides across the floor, hitting the hard metal walls. You can hear the muffled voices of the men in the front, laughing and talking about what they are going to buy with the money. Do you try to talk to them? Do you beg for your life? Or do you stay silent, hoping that your family will pay the price? Because here is the thing about Mexico in 2009. There was a code. If you were a businessman and you got snatched, it was a transaction. You were the commodity and your family was the buyer. If the buyer paid the price, the commodity was returned. That was the honor among thieves that kept the system running. The partner knew this. He told himself that as long as his wife followed the rules, he would be home for dinner eventually. The kidnappers made their call 2 hours later. They didn't use a voice changer. They were bold. They demanded an amount of money that would have crippled most families, but for the partner's estate, it was reachable. His wife, trembling but resolute, did exactly what the police and the negotiators told her not to do. She didn't haggle. She didn't delay. She gathered every cent, sold assets, and moved mountains to have the cash ready within 48 hours. The drop-off happened on a deserted stretch of road outside the city limits. A bag full of high-denomination bills was tossed from a moving car into a ditch, just as instructed. The family sat by the phone, waiting for the call that would tell them where to pick him up. They expected a location, a gas station, a church, a park. They were ready to forgive the terror, as long as the man they loved was returned to the head of that mahogany table in the gated community. But the call never came. Instead, 24 hours after the money vanished into the hands of the kidnappers, a local police patrol noticed a flock of vultures circling a vacant lot on the outskirts of Mexico City. The lot was a graveyard of rusted car parts and discarded tires, a place where the city's waste was forgotten. In the center of that lot, lying face down in the gray dust, was the partner. He was still wearing his light blue shirt and his burgundy silk tie. When the coroner turned him over, the horror of the crime became clear. He hadn't been caught in a crossfire. He hadn't died from an accident. He had been strangled. The marks around his neck were deep and precise, indicating that he had been killed slowly and with intent. But more importantly, his family realized that the time of death was only hours after the ransom had been paid. The kidnappers had taken the money, and then they had taken his life. This was a signature crime that signaled the end of an era in Mexico. The drug wars had reached a level of depravity where the old rules no longer applied. The kidnappers didn't kill him because they had to. They killed him because they could. They executed the witness to ensure their own safety, proving that cooperation was no longer a guarantee of survival. They had broken the only thing that kept the kidnapping industry predictable, the trust in the trade. The partner survived the initial snatching, he survived the terror of the van, and his family did everything right. But he couldn't survive the total breakdown of human morality that had infected the streets he once owned. He was left in that lot as a message to everyone else that in the new world of 2009, even the richest man with the best intentions could be discarded like trash. His death remains a haunting reminder of a city that lost its soul. The investigation into his murder eventually hit the same wall of silence that protected the kidnappers. The men in the balaclavas were never found, and the money was never recovered. Christian de la Fuente lost a partner, and a family lost their superhero. But as the grief settled over that gated community in Mexico City, thousands of miles away in South America, a very different kind of darkness was beginning to take shape in the mind of a young man. While the partner was a victim of a professional, cold-blooded system of greed, the next person we are going to talk about was a victim of a scripted, imaginary world. In the sprawling city of Sao Paulo, Brazil, a teenager was becoming obsessed with the themes of death and nihilism found in Japanese manga. He wasn't looking for money, and he wasn't looking for power. He was looking for a way to make his dark fantasies a reality, starting with a girl he called a friend. The transition from the calculated violence of a Mexican cartel to the distorted psychological violence of a lonely otaku shows just how many ways a life can be ended. One was for profit, the other was for a narrative, but both left behind a trail of broken families and questions that no amount of investigation could truly answer. Let us travel south to Brazil to see what happens when the line between a comic book and real life completely disappears. The smell inside that bedroom in Sao Paulo was not the smell of a normal teenager. It did not have the scent of gym shoes or cheap cologne. Instead, the air was thick with the metallic, chemical odor of printer ink and the dry, dusty aroma of thousands of stacked paper pages. It was a stagnant smell, the kind that only exists in a room where the windows are never opened and the only light comes from the flickering blue glow of a computer monitor. In the silence of the night, the only sound was the rhythmic, surgical clicking of a computer mouse and the occasional soft crinkle of a page being turned. There was a low hum from a cooling fan that never seemed to stop, vibrating through the floorboards like a distant, nervous heartbeat. If you stood in the center of that room, you could feel the weight of the stories surrounding you, thousands of fictional lives and deaths pressed into ink and paper. It was an environment designed for a very specific type of isolation, where the boundaries between the real world and the illustrated world began to blur into something unrecognizable. The walls were covered in posters of characters with oversized eyes and jagged hair, their expressions frozen in permanent states of rage or existential sorrow. It was a place where someone could easily lose track of who they were, and more importantly, what it meant to be human. The young man at the center of this story was an 18-year-old student named Anderson. To his teachers and his neighbors, he was the definition of invisible. He was the quiet boy who always sat in the back row, his head down, scribbling in a notebook that no one ever asked to see. He didn't cause trouble, he didn't have a loud voice, and he didn't seem to have any enemies. He was just another face in the massive, churning crowd of the Brazilian metropolis. But Anderson had a secret world that was far more vivid than his reality. He was a dedicated otaku, a term used for people with an intense obsession with anime and manga. But he wasn't interested in the bright, colorful stories about friendship and magic. He was drawn to the dark, nihilistic themes of seinen manga stories that explored the meaninglessness of life, the beauty of destruction, and the idea that some people were meant to be predators. He spent his allowance on volumes that featured grim reapers and cold-blooded assassins who viewed the world as a game. He began to see himself not as a lonely student, but as a misunderstood philosopher who was too advanced for the mundane society around him. He had one close friend, a teenage girl who shared some of his interests, but she saw the stories as entertainment. Anderson, however, was starting to see them as a set of instructions. Anderson's daily routine was a masterclass in quiet, obsessive preparation. Every afternoon, he would walk home from school at the exact same pace, taking the same shortcut through the park, and lock himself in his room. He would spend the first 3 hours of his evening organizing his collection. He didn't just stack the books, he aligned them so their spines formed a perfect, unbroken line of color, measuring the distance with a plastic ruler. He would then open his favorite volume and read it for the 100th time. He didn't just read the words, he studied the panels. He looked at the way the artist drew the trajectory of a blade, the way the light hit a character's eyes right before they committed an act of violence. He would take a charcoal pencil and trace those lines onto a separate sheet of paper, over and over again, until his hand moved with the same cold precision as the illustrator's. After his studies, he would turn to his computer. He spent hours on obscure web forums, talking to other isolated young men about the logic of the void. He would type out long, rambling essays about why the laws of men didn't apply to those who truly understood the nature of death. He would edit these posts carefully, deleting a comma here, changing a word there, as if he were writing a script for a movie that only he could see in his head. Then came the hardware preparation. He bought a digital camcorder, a cheap model but good enough to capture a clear image. He didn't just turn it on. He practiced setting it up. He would place the tripod in the corner of his room, adjust the height, and sit in his chair to check the framing. He wanted to make sure that the posters on his wall were visible in the background, providing the proper aesthetic for the message he was planning to record. He would talk to the empty room, rehearsing his philosophical justification. He recorded himself dozens of times, watching the footage back and critiquing his own performance. He found that his voice was too high, so he practiced lowering it, making it sound more detached and cool. He wanted to look like the characters in his books, the ones who could end a life without a single flicker of emotion. This was his mundane stretch, a slow descent into madness. The subtle shift happened on a Tuesday in 2009. Anderson sent a text message to his female friend, inviting her over to his house to look at some new manga he had just acquired. On the surface, it was a normal invitation, but the wording was slightly different. Instead of saying, "Hey, come over," he wrote a formal sentence. "It is time for us to conclude the narrative we have been discussing. Please arrive at 4 o'clock precisely." His friend noticed the odd tone, but she dismissed it as Anderson just being his typical, dramatic self. She arrived at his door at the designated time, carrying her backpack and expecting an afternoon of drawing and talking. Anderson opened the door, but he didn't greet her with a smile. He simply stepped aside and gestured toward his room. The house was empty, his parents were at work, and the silence in the hallway felt heavy and unnatural. As she walked into his bedroom, she noticed that the light was different. The curtains were drawn tight, and a single desk lamp was pointed toward the center of the floor, creating a stark, theatrical circle of light. The camcorder was already on its tripod, its small red recording light blinking like an angry eye in the shadows. She laughed nervously and asked him if he was making a movie. Anderson didn't laugh back. He just sat down and hit the play button. "You are that girl. You are standing in a room you have visited a dozen times before, but today, nothing feels right. Your friend, the boy you used to draw with, is looking at you with eyes that seem to be seeing right through you, as if you are just an obstacle in his way. You see, the camera pointed at you. You see a kitchen knife sitting on the desk, right next to a stack of books about death. Every instinct in your body is screaming at you to run. But you hesitate. This is your friend. You tell yourself that he is just playing a prank, that he is being edgy like the characters he loves. Do you turn around and walk out that door right now? Or do you stay and try to talk him down, believing that the bond you have is stronger than the dark fantasies in his head? You have 5 seconds to make a choice, but in those 5 seconds, Anderson has already moved to block the only exit from the room. He didn't hesitate. Anderson attacked his friend with the same rehearsed precision he had practiced for months. He didn't scream or show rage. He stayed quiet, his face a mask of cold indifference. He used the knife he had sharpened while listening to his favorite soundtracks. The struggle was short, and the outcome was exactly what he had scripted in his mind. He then turned to the camera, which had been recording the entire horrific event from the corner. The bizarre reveal came when the police later recovered that footage. They didn't find a video of a panicked teenager who had made a mistake. They found a multi-part narrative. Anderson had recorded a long monologue after the act, where he looked directly into the lens and explained his philosophical justification. He spoke about how he had liberated his friend from the boredom of existence, and how this was the ultimate expression of his art. He had attempted to turn a gruesome, real-world murder into a scripted anime plot. He talked about himself in the third person, using the terminology of manga to describe the climax of his story. He wasn't seeking money or revenge. He was seeking clout in a dark, twisted way, wanting to be remembered as a real-life version of a fictional monster. He had completely detached himself from reality, viewing a human life as nothing more than a plot point. The case sparked a massive national debate in Brazil. People blamed the violent media, the isolation of the internet, and the failure of the school system to notice the warning signs. Anderson was eventually arrested and diagnosed with a severe personality disorder, but the damage was done. He had become a precursor to a new kind of criminal, the clout seeker who commits atrocities not for the act itself, but for the digital narrative that follows. Anderson's story is a terrifying reminder of what happens when the human mind loses its anchor in reality and starts to sail into the dark waters of pure fantasy. He thought he was a main character in a grand tragedy, but in the end, he was just a confused young man who destroyed 2 lives for the sake of a script that no one wanted to read. His friend was gone, and he would spend the rest of his life in a cell, far from the books he loved. But while Anderson was trying to turn his life into a dark story in Sao Paulo, thousands of miles away in the heart of Russia, another man was trapped in a very different kind of nightmare. This man wasn't a teenager obsessed with comics. He was a serious professional, a tax advisor named Sergei Magnitsky. He wasn't looking for clout or philosophical justifications. He was looking for the truth about a massive government fraud worth millions of dollars. Magnitsky's story also involves a slow descent into darkness, but his wasn't caused by fictional stories. His was caused by a very real, very corrupt system that decided he was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Just as Anderson's friend found herself trapped in a room with no escape, Sergei would find himself trapped in the brutal machinery of the Russian prison system, where the ending of his story had already been written by people in power. The air inside the Butirka prison in Moscow during the month of November does not just feel cold. It feels heavy, saturated with a dampness that seems to seep directly out of the stone walls and into your marrow. It is a smell that is impossible to wash off, a mixture of ancient dust, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acidic scent of industrial-grade bleach that never quite masks the underlying odor of rot. Every breath you take feels like swallowing a wet, freezing rag. In the deep silence of the hallways, the only sound is the rhythmic, metallic clacking of a guard's boots against the iron floorboards. It is a slow, deliberate sound that echoes off the low ceilings, followed by the heavy, echoing thud of a steel bolt sliding into place. Between those sounds, if you listen closely, you can hear the faint, persistent scratching of rats behind the pipes and the low, guttural coughs of men who have forgotten what the sun looks like. There is no natural light here. The only illumination comes from flickering fluorescent tubes that hum with a high-pitched electric whine, casting a sickly greenish hue over everything. The moisture on the walls catches this light, making the stones look like they are sweating or weeping. It is a place designed to break the spirit before it breaks the body, an environment where time stops being a measurement and starts being a weight that slowly crushes you. Sergei Magnitsky was a 37-year-old tax advisor who lived a life defined by order, logic, and a deep, unwavering respect for the law. He was not a revolutionary or a politician. He was a man who found comfort in the black and white world of balance sheets and legal statutes. He lived in a modest apartment in Moscow with his wife, Natalia, and their 2 young sons. To Sergei, a perfect evening was sitting at his kitchen table, helping his boys with their math. He was a man who believed that if you followed the rules would protect you. He worked for a firm called Firestone Duncan, and his reputation was built on his meticulous attention to detail. He was the kind of person who would spend 3 hours tracking down a discrepancy of 5 cents just because it was the right thing to do. He didn't see numbers as just data. He saw them as a reflection of the truth, and he believed the truth was the ultimate authority. Sergei was well liked by his colleagues, known for his dry wit and his ability to stay calm under immense pressure. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, always wearing a neatly pressed shirt and carrying a leather briefcase that was organized with surgical precision. He loved his country, and he believed that by uncovering financial irregularities, he was helping Russia become a fairer, more transparent place. He had no idea that his love for the truth would become his death warrant. Every morning, Sergei followed a routine that was as predictable as the tax codes he studied. He would wake up at 6:30, kiss his wife, and spend exactly 15 minutes drinking a cup of strong black tea while reading the morning papers. He liked the physical sensation of the newsprint between his fingers and the quiet scratch of his pen as he made notes in the margins. He would then walk his sons to the bus stop, making sure their coats were buttoned to the top. Once he reached his office, he would settle into his chair and begin the slow, methodical process of auditing. He would open a thick manila folder, feeling the texture of the paper, and begin to cross-reference thousands of lines of data. He used a fountain pen with blue ink, and he enjoyed the smooth, fluid motion of the nib as he checked off each verified entry. He would work for 4 hours straight, never looking at the clock, completely absorbed in the logic. During his lunch break, he would walk to a small cafe 2 blocks away and order the same bowl of beet soup every single day. He liked the consistency of it. He would sit by the window, watching the people of Moscow rush by, thinking about the patterns of the city. He would then return to his desk and continue his work until exactly 6 o'clock. He never took shortcuts. He believed that the integrity of the whole was only as strong as the smallest, most mundane detail. This mundane stretch of his life lasted for years. He reviewed hundreds of thousands of documents, filed thousands of pages of reports, and attended hundreds of meetings. He was a master of the tedious, a champion of the boring. He found a strange kind of peace in the repetition of his work. He believed that as long as he stayed within the lines and did his job with total honesty, he was safe. He was an anchor of normalcy in a world that was quietly drifting toward chaos. The subtle shift occurred in late 2007 during a routine review of records for a client called Hermitage Capital. Sergei noticed a series of documents that didn't just have an error, they felt wrong. It was a discrepancy in the stamps used on official tax refunds. The ink was a slightly different shade of red, and the alignment of the seal was off by less than a millimeter. To anyone else, it was nothing. To Sergei, it was a flashing red light in a dark room. He began to dig deeper, and the more he looked, the more the reality shifted. He discovered that a group of high-ranking police officers and tax officials had effectively hijacked his clients' companies to pull off a $230 million tax fraud. It was the largest in Russian history. Sergei didn't feel fear. He felt a sense of professional indignation. He assumed that the higher authorities simply didn't know about it and that it was his duty to tell them. He filed a formal testimony, naming the specific officers involved. He believed the system would now swing into action to arrest the criminals. But instead, a week later, the very officers he had accused showed up at his front door. They didn't come with questions. They came with handcuffs. As Sergei was led away in front of his crying children, he still believed it was a mistake. He thought that once he spoke to a judge and showed his evidence, the logic would prevail. You are sitting on a hard wooden bench in a cell that is barely 6 feet wide. You have been in custody for 358 days without a trial. Your body, which was once healthy and strong, is failing you. You have a constant stabbing pain in your abdomen from gallstones and pancreatitis, but every time you ask for a doctor, the guards just laugh. They tell you that if you sign a confession retracting your testimony, the pain will go away and you can go home. The pain is so intense that you can't stand up, so you lie on the freezing floor, pressing your stomach against the cold stone to try and numb the agony. You can hear the guards talking in the hallway, their voices casual, as if you aren't even a human being to them. Do you give in? Do you sign the lie to save your life and see your sons again? Or do you hold on to the truth, even as it starts to kill you from the inside out? You have 10 minutes before they move you. Sergei Magnitsky chose the truth. He wrote over 400 complaints during his year in prison, documenting the lack of food, the freezing conditions, and the denial of medical care. He used his legal training to fight from inside the cage, believing until his final breath that the law mattered. On November 16, 2009, he was moved to a different prison unit, supposedly for medical treatment. But when he arrived, there were no doctors waiting for him. The bizarre reveal came after an independent investigation into his final hours. Sergei wasn't just neglected, he was actively eliminated. When he reached the medical unit of Buturka, he was put into a direct isolation cell. Instead of an IV drip or pain medication, he was met by 8 guards in riot gear. They didn't treat him. They handcuffed him to a bed rail and beat him with rubber batons for over an hour while he was already in the throes of a medical crisis. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the bruises on his wrists and the deep lacerations on his body told a different story. The state didn't just let him die. They weaponized neglect as a form of execution. They realized that Sergei was a man who could not be bought or intimidated, so they used the machinery of the justice system to crush him. The man who believed in the protection of the law was systematically murdered by the people who swore to uphold it. The fallout from Sergei's death was an international firestorm. It led to the creation of the Magnitsky Act in the United States, a law that allows the government to sanction individuals anywhere in the world who are involved in human rights abuses. Sergei Magnitsky became a global symbol for whistleblowers, a man whose commitment to the truth changed international law. His name is now a weapon used against the very kind of corruption that ended his life in that cold cell. But the legacy he left behind is a bittersweet one. His family remains in exile, and the officials he accused were never truly brought to justice in Russia. He was a man of logic who died in a world that had become fundamentally illogical. He was a hero who never wanted to be one, a tax advisor who became a martyr because he refused to look away from a crooked number. His story serves as the gold standard for state-sponsored murder through calculated indifference. As Sergei's life came to an end in the harsh reality of a Russian prison, on the other side of the globe, another man was facing a different kind of imprisonment. In the neon-drenched streets of Tokyo, Japan, a man was living in a space even smaller than a prison cell. He was a ghost in the machine, a member of the lost generation who had fallen through every crack in society. He wasn't fighting a corrupt government, he was fighting a soul-crushing isolation. While Sergei fought to stay alive in a system that wanted him dead, this man in Tokyo would choose to commit a violent act just so the system would finally take him in. He would trade his freedom for a cell, looking for the very things Sergei was denied, a meal and a roof. The contrast between these two lives shows the terrifying range of the human experience in 2009. Let us head to Japan to see what happens when the city lights become too bright to bear. The air inside a 24-hour internet cafe in Tokyo does not move. It is a stagnant, recycled soup of cigarette smoke, the salty steam of instant ramen, and the faint, sour tang of human sweat that has settled into the carpet over years. There is a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrates through the soles of your feet, the sound of 300 computer cooling fans spinning in unison, fighting a losing battle against the heat of the machines. In the narrow aisles, the only light comes from the glowing taskbars of monitors, bleeding out from under the half-height booth doors. It is a flickering, artificial blue that makes everyone's skin look like cold marble. Occasionally, you hear the soft, rhythmic clicking of a mechanical keyboard or the muffled sob of someone 3 stalls down. But mostly, there is a silence so profound it feels heavy. It is the sound of dozens of people being alone together in the dark. There are no windows in these places, and that is by design. Without the sun, time loses its meaning. You cannot tell if it is 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 3 o'clock in the morning. The only clock that matters is the one on the login screen, counting down the minutes until your prepaid session expires. It is an environment that feels like a waiting room for a life that is never going to start, a place where you can disappear without ever leaving the center of the city. The man we are talking about was a 40-year-old named Kazuo. To anyone passing him on the street, he was completely invisible. He was a shadow in a cheap, slightly wrinkled suit jacket that he had owned for 8 years. He had the tired, sunken eyes of someone who had spent a decade apologizing for things that weren't his fault. Kazuo was a member of Japan's lost generation, men who had entered the workforce just as the economy collapsed and never found their footing. He was a man of quiet habits and low expectations. He didn't have a home address, a bank account, or a family who called him on his birthday. His entire life was contained within a locker at the Shinjuku station and a plastic bag he carried with him. But despite his circumstances, Kazuo was not a bitter man. He was simply exhausted. He believed that if he just kept moving, if he just stayed out of the way, he would eventually find a small corner of the world where he belonged. He was the kind of person who would bow to the convenience store clerk 3 times for a bottle of water. He took pride in his appearance, using the public sinks in the train station to shave every morning with a disposable razor. He saw himself as a citizen of the city, even if the city didn't see him back. He was a man who still believed in the dignity of the grind, even when the grind had ground him down to nothing. He was the anchor of his own very small, very fragile normalcy. Kazuo's daily routine was a masterclass in the art of surviving on nothing. Every morning at 5:30, he would wake up in a cubicle that was exactly 1 meter wide and 2 meters long. He would spend the first 10 minutes of his day just sitting there, his knees tucked to his chest, waiting for the stiffness in his back to fade. He would then carefully fold the thin polyester blanket provided by the cafe, making sure the edges were perfectly aligned before placing it on the desk. He would then log off the computer, watching the screen go black, and gather his few belongings. He would walk to the communal sink, wait for his turn, and spend exactly 5 minutes washing his face and neck. He used a small travel-sized bar of soap that he kept in a plastic Ziploc bag. He would then brush his teeth, looking at his reflection in the stained mirror, reminding himself to keep his shoulders back. He wanted to look like someone who had a place to go. By 6:15, he was out on the street. He would spend the next 12 hours walking. He didn't walk to get anywhere. He walked to keep his blood moving. He would visit the public libraries to read the newspapers, staying for hours in the back corner where it was warm. He would read the job listings, knowing he didn't have the phone number or the address required to apply, but he read them anyway. It was a way to feel like he was still a part of the conversation. At noon, he would find a park bench and eat his only meal of the day, a single rice ball and a small carton of tea from a discount shop. He would chew slowly, making the food last for 20 minutes, savoring the texture of the seaweed. He would watch the salarymen in their expensive suits rushing past him, and he would imagine what they were having for lunch. He didn't feel jealousy, he just felt a profound sense of distance, as if they were living in a different dimension. As the sun began to set, Kazuo would make his way back toward the internet cafe district. He would count his coins, making sure he had exactly 2,000 yen. That was the price of a 12-hour night pack. It gave him a cubicle, a computer, and a place to hide from the wind. He would stand in line at the counter, hand over his money with a polite bow, and receive his plastic key card. This was his mundane stretch, a cycle he had repeated for over 700 days. The subtle shift happened on a Tuesday in October of 2009. Kazuo reached into his pocket to pay for his night pack, but his fingers only found a single 500 yen coin and a few copper pieces. He checked his other pocket. Nothing. He checked the lining of his jacket. Nothing. He stood there at the counter, the bright fluorescent lights reflecting off his forehead, and realized that for the first time in 2 years, he could not afford his cubicle. The clerk behind the counter, a teenager with dyed hair and a bored expression, didn't look up from his phone. He just waited for the money. Kazuo felt a cold, sharp spike of panic in his chest. It wasn't just about the bed, it was about the wall. If he couldn't pay for the pack, he would have to stay outside. And if he stayed outside, he would look like a homeless man. His dignity, the only thing he had left, was tied to that 2,000 yen transaction. He turned away from the counter without a word and walked back out into the Tokyo night. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, and a thin, biting rain had started to fall. Kazuo stood under the neon sign of a karaoke bar, watching his breath mist in the air. He realized that the cycle was finally broken. He had no more coins to count, no more libraries to hide in, and no more reasons to bow. The city was finally going to swallow him whole. He started walking toward the Shinjuku station, but his pace was different now. He wasn't walking to keep warm. He was walking with a destination. He passed a hardware store that was just closing up for the night, and he saw a small, stainless steel kitchen knife sitting in a bargain bin near the entrance. He didn't hesitate. He picked it up, tucked it into his waistband, and kept moving. He didn't feel like a citizen anymore. He felt like a ghost who wanted to become a man again. You are walking down a crowded sidewalk in one of the busiest districts in the world. Thousands of people are brushing past you, their umbrellas clashing together like shields. You have a knife against your skin. You have no money, no food, and no place to sleep. You see a man in a black coat standing near a vending machine, his back turned to you. He looks successful. He looks like he has a home with a warm bed and a refrigerator full of food. In that moment, your mind offers you two paths. You can keep walking until you collapse from the cold, becoming just another statistic of the cyber homeless who died on a park bench. Or, you can do something so violent, so undeniable, that the state will be forced to take care of you. You can trade your freedom for a roof and a meal. Do you take that step? Do you reach for the handle of that knife? Or do you let the city's rain wash you away into nothingness? Kazuo didn't think about the victim. He didn't think about the pain. He only thought about the heat of a prison cell. He stepped up behind the stranger and struck. It wasn't a professional attack. It was a desperate, clumsy lunge. The man screamed, and the crowd around them froze for a heartbeat before exploding into a chaos of shouts and running feet. Kazuo didn't try to run. He didn't try to hide the knife. He just dropped to his knees and waited. The bizarre reveal came during his interrogation at the police station. Kazuo wasn't defiant, and he wasn't remorseful. He was calm. He looked at the detectives and explained that he had committed the crime because he couldn't afford his internet cafe rent anymore. He told them that in prison, he would have 3 meals a day and a doctor if he got sick. He viewed his arrest not as a downfall, but as a promotion. He had finally found a way to get off the streets. The case sent shockwaves through Japanese society. It exposed the cyber-homeless crisis, a hidden underclass of thousands of men and women who were living in 24-hour cafes because the traditional economy had no room for them. Kazuo had used extreme violence as a cry for help, or more accurately, as an application for a different kind of cubicle. He was a man who decided that being a prisoner was better than being invisible. Kazuo got exactly what he wanted. He was sentenced to several years in a state penitentiary. For the first time in a decade, he had a schedule that didn't involve wandering the streets and a bed that didn't require a plastic key card. He became a number in a system, but to Kazuo, that number felt more real than the ghost he had been in Tokyo. He had successfully traded his soul for the certainty of a 4-walled room and a bowl of rice. His story is a haunting reflection of what happens when a society's safety net has so many holes that a man sees a prison cell as a sanctuary. Kazuo wasn't a monster born of malice. He was a monster created by isolation and the crushing weight of being forgotten. He had found his corner of the world, but it was a corner with bars on the windows and a lock on the door. He was finally home, and he never intended to leave. But while Kazuo was finding a way into a cell in Tokyo, 3,000 miles away in the Lake District of England, another man was desperately trying to get out of one. In 2009, the case of Gordon Park, the man accused of being the killer behind the Lady in the Lake mystery, was reaching a breaking point. Unlike Kazuo, Gordon didn't want a prison meal. He wanted his name back, and he wanted the world to know the truth about what happened in 1976. While Kazuo used a knife to change his future, the case in England was being changed by something much smaller, a microscopic strand of DNA. As Kazuo settled into his new life behind bars, a new forensic breakthrough was about to reopen a cold case that had haunted the British countryside for decades. The story of the Lady in the Lake shows that sometimes, even when a case is closed and the prisoner is dead, the mystery is only just beginning. The water of Coniston Water in the Lake District of England does not just feel cold. In the deep winter, it feels like a liquid blade that cuts through clothing and skin until it reaches your very bones. It is a dark, tea-colored expanse of water that swallows the light, hiding secrets beneath a surface that is often as smooth as a sheet of obsidian. When the wind dies down, the silence over the lake is so absolute that it feels heavy, like a physical weight pressing against your ears. There is a specific smell that clings to the shoreline, a mixture of damp slate, rotting pine needles, and the faint, metallic scent of iron-rich soil. It is an ancient smell that reminds you that this landscape was carved by glaciers thousands of years ago. On a foggy morning, the mist rolls off the fells and sits on the water in thick gray ribbons, obscuring the horizon until you cannot tell where the lake ends and the sky begins. It is a place where things stay hidden for a very long time. In the depths, 70 feet below the surface, the temperature never changes. It remains a constant, freezing 39 degrees Fahrenheit. At that depth, there is no light and very little oxygen. It is a natural preservation chamber, a place where time slows down to a crawl. If something is weighted down and dropped into those shadows, the lake does not destroy it. It cradles it, keeping the history of a tragedy perfectly intact, waiting for the day the surface is finally disturbed. Gordon Park was a 65-year-old retired schoolteacher who, to many, was the pillar of his community. He was a man of medium height with a gentle face and a voice that was accustomed to explaining complex ideas to children. He lived in a stone house that was always filled with the smell of old books and wood smoke. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, respectable widower who spent his afternoons gardening and his evenings reading by the fire. He was the definition of a stable, reliable man. He had spent decades building this life of quiet dignity. He was the kind of person who always had a spare umbrella for a friend and who never forgot a birthday. He was deeply involved in local clubs and was seen as a man who valued tradition and order. He carried himself with a certain stiffness, a remnant of an older generation that believed in keeping one's emotions tucked away behind a polite smile. He was a man who felt like a permanent fixture of the English countryside. But beneath that calm exterior, Gordon carried a shadow that had followed him since 1976. That was the year his wife, Carol, had simply vanished. For 21 years, Gordon lived as a man under suspicion, a man whose wife had walked out on him and never looked back. Or at least, that was the story he told. He raised their children alone, maintained the house, and never wavered in his claim of innocence. He was an anchor of normalcy in a town that whispered behind his back. Gordon's daily life in the years following his wife's disappearance was a masterclass in the mundane. Every Saturday morning at exactly 8:30, he would walk to the local market to buy a small loaf of crusty bread and a pint of milk. He would exchange the same 3 sentences with the shopkeeper about the weather and the state of the roads. He would then walk home, taking the long route along the lake, his boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel path as he moved with a steady, purposeful gait. Once home, he would spend 4 hours in his workshop. He was a skilled amateur stonemason, and he liked the physical sensation of the chisel hitting the rock. He would spend hours smoothing a single edge, his movements repetitive and hypnotic. He found a strange kind of peace in the dust and the noise. He would then make himself a simple lunch of cheese and pickles, sitting at the same wooden table where he had once sat with Carol. He never moved her chair. He kept it exactly where it was. In the afternoons, he would tend to his garden. He had a specific way of pruning the rose bushes, a sequence of cuts he had memorized 30 years ago. He would move from plant to plant, his hands covered in dark soil, focused entirely on the small, delicate tasks. He would check the rain gauge, record the results in a leather-bound journal, and then clean his tools with an oily rag until they shone. He believed that as long as his routine was perfect, his world would remain under control. This stretch of normalcy lasted for over 2 decades. He saw his children grow up and move away. He retired from teaching. He became an old man in a quiet village. He had successfully outrun the tragedy of 1976 by simply being the most boring, most predictable man in the county. He believed that time had buried the past, just as the lake had buried whatever secrets lay beneath its dark surface. But the lake is not a graveyard, it is a vault, and in 1997, the vault was opened. The subtle shift happened when amateur divers found a bundle wrapped in a lead-weighted pinafore dress at the bottom of Coniston Water. It was the body of Carol Park, perfectly preserved by the cold. Suddenly, the quiet schoolteacher was no longer a widower. He was a murder suspect. The evidence was circumstantial, but powerful. The knots used to tie the weights were professional, the kind a stonemason like Gordon would know. In 2004, after decades of silence, the law finally caught up with him. Gordon was sentenced to life in prison, but even behind bars, he maintained his routine. He became the model prisoner, a quiet old man who spent his days in the prison library and never caused a single problem. He wrote letters to his lawyers every week, always using the same blue ink and the same polite tone. He insisted that he was a victim of a terrible mistake. He told anyone who would listen that the truth was still out there, hidden in the microscopic details that the jury had ignored. By early 2009, Gordon was 74 years old, and his health was beginning to fail. He had spent 5 years in a cell, and the weight of the world's hatred had started to crush him. He received a letter from his legal team about a new forensic breakthrough. They were going to test DNA found on Carol's clothing using techniques that didn't exist in 1976. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope that the logic of science would finally align with his story. You are Gordon Park. It is the morning of your 74th birthday. You are sitting in cell 29, looking out at a patch of gray sky through a narrow, barred window. You have the forensic report on your small desk, but you haven't opened it yet. Your hands are shaking. You have spent 33 years being called a monster. You have lost your wife, your freedom, and your reputation. You are tired of fighting a ghost that everyone else claims is you. The silence in the cell is different today. It feels heavy, like the water at the bottom of the lake. You look at the rope you have fashioned from your bedding. You look at the door where the guards will soon come to bring you a meal you don't want to eat. Do you wait for the lawyers to call? Do you wait for the DNA results that might prove you were telling the truth all along? Or do you decide that the only way to find peace is to follow Carol into the dark? On January 23, 2009, the guards found Gordon Park dead in his cell. He had taken his own life on his birthday, leaving behind a family still divided and a public that largely believed he had taken his secret to the grave. It seemed like the final, tragic end to the Lady in the Lake mystery. The case was closed, the prisoner was dead, and the story was over. But then, the bizarre reveal happened just weeks after Gordon was buried in the cold English soil. The forensic results came back from the lab. The new DNA testing on Carol Park's clothing found something that no one expected. There was a microscopic trace of DNA that did not belong to Gordon Park. It belonged to an unknown third party. More shockingly, further analysis suggested a potential link to a notorious serial killer who had been active in the area during the mid-70s. The stonemason's knots that had convicted Gordon were also a signature of this other man. The revelation sent shockwaves through the British justice system. Gordon Park had died just as the evidence that could have exonerated him was finally being processed. The man who had been called a cold-blooded killer for 30 years might have actually been an innocent man who was simply too broken to wait for the truth. The case remains one of the most contentious closed cases in the United Kingdom, a haunting reminder that the system is only as good as the technology of its time. Gordon Park spent the last 3 decades of his life in a different kind of prison, a prison of suspicion and public scorn. He went to his grave with the world believing he was a monster, while the real killer might have been walking free for 40 years. The Lady in the Lake finally gave up her secrets, but she did so in a way that ensured the tragedy would never truly be resolved. The truth was there, but it arrived exactly 1 lifetime too late. The story of Gordon Park is a warning about the finality of judgment and the slow, often cruel pace of justice. He was a man who tried to live a normal life while a storm gathered on the horizon, a storm that eventually swallowed him whole. His death was not an admission of guilt, but a final act of despair from a man who had run out of time. He left behind a mystery that is now colder than the water at the bottom of Coniston Water. But as the mystery of the Lady in the Lake left the British public with more questions than answers, across the Atlantic Ocean, a different kind of family tragedy was unfolding in the quiet town of Kingston, Ontario. In the summer of 2009, another car would be found at the bottom of a canal, and another family would claim it was a tragic accident. But this time, the secrets wouldn't take 30 years to surface. They would come out in a matter of days. While Gordon Park's story was about the possibility of an innocent man being destroyed by the system, the story of the Shafia sisters is about a system of honor that was used to justify the destruction of the innocent. We are moving from the cold lakes of England to the dark canals of Canada, where a father's desire for control would lead to a crime so calculated it would leave an entire nation in shock. Let's see what was waiting at the bottom of the Rideau Canal. The water at the Kingston Mills locks in Ontario does not move with a current. It sits there, dark and stagnant, like a heavy sheet of black glass, reflecting the summer moon. In the middle of the night, the only sound you hear is the low, rhythmic croaking of bullfrogs and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. But on June 30th, 2009, that silence was broken by a sound that didn't belong in the Canadian wilderness. It was a wet, heavy thud, followed by the sound of gurgling air as something massive began to displace the water. If you were standing on the granite edge of the lock, you would have smelled the sharp, chemical tang of gasoline mixing with the muddy scent of the canal. You would have seen bubbles rising to the surface, illuminated for a split second by the pale light of the stars, before the water smoothed over again, leaving nothing but a few ripples behind. The cold beneath that surface is absolute. Even in the height of summer, the deep water inside the locks remains at a temperature that can steal the breath from your lungs in seconds. It is a lightless, crushing environment where the mud at the bottom is thick and soft, ready to swallow anything that settles into it. There was no screaming, no splashing, just a slow, deliberate descent into the silt, as 4 lives were extinguished in the total darkness of the canal. Zainab, Sahar, and Gidi Shafia were 19, 17, and 13 years old. To their classmates in Montreal, they were typical Canadian teenagers trying to find their way in the world. Zainab was the oldest, a beautiful young woman with a defiant spark in her eyes who dreamed of true love. Sahar was the quiet one, a gifted student who loved fashion and secretly kept a boyfriend. Gidi was the rebel, a 13-year-old who just wanted to wear jeans and go to the mall. They were part of a large, wealthy family that had immigrated from Afghanistan to Canada, seeking a better life. To the outside world, the Shafia family was a success story. Their father, Mohammed, was a self-made millionaire who owned commercial real estate. Their mother, Tuba, was a soft-spoken woman who seemed dedicated to her 7 children. They lived in a large, comfortable home and drove expensive cars. They appeared to be the perfect picture of a family. But inside that home, the atmosphere was very different. The girls were living in 2 worlds that were constantly at war. In one world, they were Canadian kids who wanted to listen to pop music, use social media, and date boys they liked. In the other world, they were subjects of a strict, patriarchal household where their every move was monitored by their father and their older brother, Hamed. They were caught in a trap made of tradition and absolute control. The family's road trip to Niagara Falls in late June of 2009 was supposed to be a celebration, a way to relax before the heat of midsummer. Every morning of that trip followed a very specific, mundane pattern. Mohammed would wake up early and check the oil and tire pressure on their 2 vehicles, a silver Nissan Sentra and a black Lexus SUV. He would spend 10 minutes wiping the dust off the windshields, moving his cloth in slow, circular motions. While he worked on the cars, the girls would pack their bags. They would spend a long time deciding which outfits to bring, whispering to each other about the boys they might see or the photos they wanted to take. They would fold their clothes neatly, tucking away the Western items at the bottom of their suitcases where their father wouldn't see them. They would then load the trunk, making sure the heavy bags were at the bottom and the snacks were on top. The drive from Montreal to Niagara Falls took over 7 hours. They stopped at the same chain gas stations every 100 miles. Mohammed would pull up to the pump, get out, and stand there with his arms crossed while the tank filled. The girls would go inside to buy bags of chips, bottles of soda, and magazines. They would stand in line, laughing and talking, enjoying the brief freedom of being away from their father's direct gaze in the crowded convenience stores. They spent several days in Niagara Falls, doing the most touristy things imaginable. They took the boat tour into the mist of the falls, wearing blue plastic ponchos and getting soaked by the spray. They walked along the crowded sidewalks of Clifton Hill, looking at the wax museums and the haunted houses. They ate ice cream cones that melted in the sun, and they took hundreds of photos of each other smiling against the backdrop of the massive, thundering water. To anyone watching them, they looked like the happiest family in Canada. They spent hours sitting on park benches, watching the crowds go by. Mohammed would point out different landmarks, explaining the history of the area in a calm, fatherly voice. The girls would nod and listen, playing the role of the dutiful daughters. They followed the rules, they stayed together, and they laughed at their father's jokes. It was a long, sustained stretch of perfect normalcy. On the night of June 29th, they began the drive back to Montreal. They stopped for dinner at a fast food restaurant, where the girls shared fries and talked about their favorite parts of the trip. The conversation was light and repetitive, the kind of small talk families have when they are tired from a long day of travel. Mohammed sat at the end of the table, sipping a coffee, watching his daughters with an expression that was impossible to read. The subtle shift happened when they reached the city of Kingston around midnight. Instead of staying on the main highway toward Montreal, Mohammed led the two cars off the exit and toward a secluded area known as the Kingston Mills Locks. He told the family they were going to look for a motel because he was too tired to keep driving. But as they turned onto the narrow, unlit gravel road leading to the canal, the air inside the silver Nissan Sentra became cold. Hamed, the older brother, was driving the Lexus SUV behind them. He wasn't looking for motel signs. He was watching the taillights of the Nissan, where his three sisters and his father's first wife, Rona, were sitting. The Nissan began to slow down as it approached the edge of the water. There was no motel in sight. There were no streetlights. There was only the dark forest on one side and the deep, silent water of the canal lock on the other. Zainab, who was in the driver's seat of the Nissan, stopped the car near the edge of the concrete pier. She looked out at the water, then back at her father, who had stepped out of the Lexus. The father didn't look tired anymore. He looked focused. He told the women to stay in the car while he checked something. He walked toward the back of the Nissan, and that's when the girls heard the sound of the Lexus engine revving behind them, a low, mechanical growl. You are Zainab, sitting in that silver Nissan. The engine is idling, and you can feel the slight vibration through the steering wheel. Your sisters are in the back seat, and Rona is next to you. It is pitch black outside, and the only thing you can see is the reflection of the Lexus headlights in your rearview mirror. Your father is standing out there in the dark. You see him nod to your brother. Suddenly, you feel a massive, violent jolt from behind. The Lexus has slammed into your rear bumper. Your head snaps back, and the car begins to roll forward toward the edge of the lock. You slam your foot on the brake, but the wheels are sliding on the wet grass. The car is tilting. You look at the door handle, but it feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds. Do you try to open the door and swim? Do you stay and beg your father to stop? Or do you realize that the man who gave you life is now the one taking it away? The Nissan Sentra tipped over the edge of the granite wall and plunged into the canal. It didn't hit the water flat. It went in nose first, the weight of the engine dragging it down. Inside, the four women were thrown against the dashboard as the dark, freezing water began to gush through the vents and around the door seals. The pressure from the outside made it impossible to open the doors. They were trapped in a metal box that was rapidly filling with liquid. Mohammed and Hamed stood on the edge of the lock, watching the bubbles rise. They didn't call for help. They didn't dive in to save them. Instead, they took a piece of broken headlight glass from the ground and carefully picked it up, making sure no evidence was left behind. They then drove the Lexus back to the highway, where they staged a minor accident to explain the damage to their bumper. They went to a motel and slept, leaving the girls in the mud. The bizarre reveal came after the police recovered the car and began to investigate. Initially, the family claimed it was a tragic accident that Zainab had taken the car for a joyride and driven into the canal by mistake. But the investigators found that the car was in neutral, the ignition was off, and the seats were pushed all the way back. More importantly, they found the damage on the Lexus matched the damage on the Nissan perfectly. It was a planned execution. The most chilling evidence came from wiretaps the police placed in the family's home and car. They recorded Mohammed Shafia bragging about the murders to his wife and son. He called his daughters prostitutes and filthy because they had dishonored him by wanting to live a Western lifestyle. He said that even if they were brought back to life 100 times, he would kill them again. He viewed the murder of his children as a righteous act of cleansing. The trial was a landmark case in Canada. It brought the term honor killing into the national conversation, sparking a fierce debate about the clash between cultural traditions and human rights. Mohammed, Tuba, and Hamid were all convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The judge called the killings a cold-blooded, shameful murder motivated by a twisted concept of honor that had no place in any civilized society. The Shafia sisters never got to finish their education, they never got to marry for love, and they never got to experience the freedom they moved to Canada to find. They were victims of a system of patriarchal control that followed them across the globe, a system that viewed women as property rather than people. Their story remains one of the most heartbreaking examples of domestic femicide, a tragedy that sits at the bottom of a quiet canal in Ontario. But while the Shafia case showed the dark side of honor within a family in North America, thousands of miles away in the war-torn landscape of Iraq, a different kind of ritual execution was taking place in 2009. In the city of Mosul, the concept of honor wasn't just a family matter. It was a weapon used by entire communities to enforce religious and sectarian boundaries. There, a young man would face a fate even more public and brutal. While the Shafia girls died in the silent darkness of a car, this next victim would die in the center of a screaming mob. The transition from the calculated, secret murder in a Canadian canal to the chaotic, public stoning in the streets of Iraq shows how the same twisted logic can manifest in different ways across the world. Let us travel to Mosul to see what happens when a community decides that a rumor of love is a crime punishable by death. The sound of the city of Mosul in the height of summer is not a single noise. It is a deafening, chaotic symphony of high-pitched, rhythmic chanting that vibrates through your very teeth. It is the sound of thousands of voices rising in a jagged, angry unison that drowns out the hum of the desert wind. Beneath that screaming, there is the heavy, repetitive thud of solid objects hitting bone and earth, a wet and dull sound that seems to vibrate the very ground beneath your feet. If you were standing there in the center of that square, the air would feel like it was made of liquid heat and dry, choking dust. It is a smell that is impossible to forget, a mixture of hot limestone, burnt rubber, and the sharp, coppery scent of fresh blood that has been baked into the dirt by the 100-degree sun. The dust gets into your eyes and your throat, making every breath feel like you are swallowing sandpaper. It is an atmosphere of pure, unfiltered electricity. Every few seconds, a new sound breaks through the chanting, the sharp, whistling noise of something heavy being hurled through the air with maximum force. You can feel the wind of these objects as they fly past, followed by the sickening crunch of impact. There is no mercy in this sound. It is the sound of a community that has collectively decided to stop being human for an hour. It is a sensory overload that tells you that whatever is happening in the center of that circle is final. The young man at the center of this storm was a 22-year-old named Bashir. To his friends and his family in the Yazidi community, Bashir was a person who believed in the impossible. He had a smile that could light up a dark room and a laugh that was infectious. He worked as a mechanic in a small shop on the outskirts of Mosul, a job that left his fingernails permanently stained with black grease and his clothes smelling of motor oil and old gasoline. He was a man of simple, honest dreams. He didn't care about the political borders or the ancient religious feuds that had turned his country into a patchwork of invisible war zones. He cared about the way the light hit the Tigris River at sunset and the way a girl from the neighboring district looked when she laughed. He was a man who saw the world not as a series of obstacles, but as a place where someone could build a life if they were brave enough to reach for it. Bashir was known for his kindness, often fixing cars for people who couldn't afford to pay him in cash. He would accept a basket of fruit or a few warm loaves of bread instead, shaking their hands with a firm, respectful grip. He lived with his mother in a small concrete house, and every evening he would bring her a small gift, a flower he found by the road or a piece of honey candy from the market. He was an anchor of gentle normalcy in a city that was slowly losing its mind. Every evening, for 6 months, Bashir followed a routine that was as delicate as a clockwork mechanism. He would finish his work at the shop at exactly 6 o'clock, spending 10 minutes scrubbing his hands with a stiff brush and a bucket of gray water. He wanted to wash away the smell of the garage before he started his real journey. He would then change into a clean white shirt, smoothing the collar with his fingers and checking his reflection in a small, cracked mirror. He would walk out of the shop and begin a 3-mile trek across the city. He didn't take the main roads. He had mapped out a series of narrow, winding alleyways that allowed him to move between the different sectarian neighborhoods without being noticed. He would walk at a steady, purposeful pace, his eyes focused on the ground, never lingering too long in any one place. He knew every loose stone and every barking dog along this path. He moved like a ghost through the rubble. When he reached the invisible line that separated the Yazidi district from the neighboring area, he would wait in the shadows of an abandoned building for exactly 5 minutes. He would count his heartbeats, using the time to settle his nerves. He would then cross the street and head toward a small, walled garden behind a bakery. This was where he met her. They would sit on a low stone wall, whispering in the dark, sharing stories about their day and their hopes for a future. The mundane nature of these meetings was what made them feel safe. They would talk about the price of flour, the gossip from the market, and the songs they heard on the radio. Bashir would bring her small tokens, a shiny copper washer from the shop, or a smooth stone he had polished until it looked like marble. They would repeat the same jokes and the same promises, creating a rhythm of stability that shielded them from the reality of the war outside those garden walls. He would leave the garden at 10 o'clock precisely, retracing his steps through the maze of the city. He would reach his home, lock the door, and spend an hour staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in his head. He did this every day, 180 times in a row. He believed that the repetition of the act made it invisible. He thought that if he just kept his head down and followed the script, the world would leave them alone. He was living in a stretch of peace. The subtle shift happened on a Thursday in early 2009. Bashir was walking through his usual shortcut when he noticed that the elderly shopkeeper, who usually nodded to him, didn't look up. The man was staring intently at a piece of fruit, his hands trembling slightly. As Bashir passed, he felt a dozen pairs of eyes watching him from the darkened windows above the street. The air felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the alleyway. He reached the garden, but she wasn't there. The air smelled of burnt sugar from the bakery, but the gate was locked from the inside. He waited for 10 minutes, then 20, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs like a trapped bird. He heard a low, rhythmic whispering coming from the other side of the wall. Not the voice of his love, but the sound of dozens of men speaking in low, jagged tones. It was a sound of collective judgment that made the hair on his neck stand up. He turned to leave, but the exit was no longer empty. 3 men stood in the middle of the alleyway, their faces obscured by shadows. They weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying something much more terrifying, large, heavy stones that they were tossing from hand to hand. One of the men spoke, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. He didn't ask a question. He simply said the name of the girl and the word Yazidi. The invisible line had finally become a wall. You are Bashir, standing in that narrow alley. The walls are so close you can touch them with your elbows. You can hear the sounds of the city, the distant honking of cars, and the call to prayer, but here, in this pocket of shadow, the world has gone silent. 3 men are blocking your path, and you can hear 20 more coming up behind you. You have a wrench in your back pocket, but you know it won't be enough against a mob that believes they are doing God's work. You look up at the sky, seeing the first few stars beginning to twinkle. You think about your mother waiting for her honey candy. You think about the girl in the garden. Do you try to fight your way through, knowing you will likely be torn apart? Do you fall to your knees and beg for a mercy that you know doesn't exist in this neighborhood? Or do you stand tall and accept that the love you chose has a price that must be paid in blood? You have 3 seconds to decide. Bashir didn't run. He stood his ground as the first stone hit him in the shoulder, a dull, heavy impact that sent a jolt of white-hot pain through his arm. He didn't scream. He just watched as the 3 men became 10, and then 50, and then 100. They dragged him out of the alleyway and into the main square of the district. The crowd grew with every block they traveled, a swarm of people who had been waiting for a reason to release their pent-up rage and fear. The bizarre reveal came after the violence had finally stopped. The crowd didn't just leave Bashir's body in the square for his family to find. They had planned something far more theatrical and far more dark. They took the broken body of the Yazidi Romeo and displayed it on a prominent corner, surrounding it with the very stones they had used to kill him. It wasn't just an execution. It was an exhibit designed to fuel the sectarian tensions of 2009. The mob had been manipulated by extremist groups who wanted to spark a retaliatory cycle of violence. They used the rumor of the elopement to turn a simple romance into a casus belli. When the police finally arrived, they found that many of the people in the crowd weren't even from that neighborhood. They were outsiders who had come to Mosul specifically to turn a community against itself. The honor they claimed to be defending was nothing more than a political tool. The stoning of Bashir became a symbol of the total collapse of civil order in Iraq during that period. It showed how easily the honor of a group could be weaponized to justify the most barbaric acts of cruelty. Bashir wasn't a criminal, and he wasn't a soldier. He was a man who believed that love was stronger than a border, and he was proven wrong in the most brutal way possible. His death left a hole in his community that could never be filled by revenge. His mother waited for him that night, and every night after that, but the honey candy never arrived. The girl from the garden vanished, her fate unknown to this day. The stones in the square were eventually washed away by the rain, but the memory of the Yazidi Romeo remained, a haunting reminder of what happens when a community chooses hate over humanity. He was a man of peace who was murdered by a world that had forgotten how to be peaceful. As the echoes of the stones faded in the dusty streets of Mosul, 7,000 miles away in the rugged mountains of the North Caucasus, another man was driving his car toward a different kind of execution. Maksharip Ashev was not a young lover, but a powerful businessman and a fierce critic of a government he believed was kidnapping its own people. He knew he was being followed, but he believed that his status and his voice would protect him from the shadows. While Bashir died at the hands of a chaotic mob, Maksharip would face a much more professional and calculated end. The transition from the public, ritualistic violence in Iraq to the cold, surgical assassination in Russia shows the different faces of the same darkness. We are moving from the screams of a city square to the silent, automatic gunfire of a lonely highway. Let us head to the Caucasus to see what happens when the state decides a voice is too loud to keep. The wind that sweeps across the federal highway near Nalchik in the North Caucasus does not whisper. It howls with a jagged, mournful edge that carries the scent of cold pine needles and damp earth. In late October, the air is so crisp, it feels like it might shatter if you speak too loudly. Underneath the wind, there is the relentless, hypnotic rhythm of tires rolling over uneven pavement, a low, humming vibration that you feel in the soles of your feet and the base of your skull. If you stood on the shoulder of that road, the silence between the passing cars would feel heavy, almost suffocating. It is an environment of vast, open spaces and towering mountains that seem to watch everything with a cold, indifferent eye. There is the faint, metallic tang of industrial exhaust lingering in the air, mixed with the smell of wood smoke from distant villages. It is a beautiful landscape, but it is also a place where the shadows seem to move even when the sun is out. The only other sound is the occasional, sharp crack of a dry branch or the rustle of dead leaves in the ditch. It is a sensory world that demands constant vigilance. You find yourself listening for the one sound that doesn't belong, the high-pitched whine of an accelerating engine or the metallic slide of a car door opening. On October 25th, 2009, the mountain air was perfectly clear, making every sound feel magnified, every movement feel like it was being recorded. Maksharip Ashev was a 43-year-old businessman who had everything most men spent their lives chasing. He was wealthy, influential, and respected within his community in Ingushetia. He had a sharp mind for logistics and a personality that naturally commanded a room. He was a father who loved to sit on his porch in the evenings, watching his children play, and he was a husband who took pride in providing a life of comfort and security for his family. He was a man who believed in the power of the individual. He wasn't a politician by choice, but by necessity. He was a successful entrepreneur who only became an activist after his own son and nephew were abducted by unidentified men in 2007. That event changed him. It stripped away the businessman's suit and revealed a man of steel who would not be intimidated. He became a voice for the voiceless, a man who documented the disappearances that plagued his region. Despite the danger, Max Sharp maintained a sense of quiet normalcy. He still went to the office every day, still attended weddings, and still drove his own car. He carried himself with a dignified calm, a man who knew he was walking on a tightrope but refused to look down. He was a pillar of his community, the kind of man people went to when the law failed them. He was the anchor of stability in a world that felt like it was constantly being pulled apart by invisible hands. Max Sharp's daily routine was a masterclass in calculated precision. Every morning, he would spend 15 minutes checking his car a silver Lada before he even touched the door handle. He would look under the wheel wells for anything that didn't belong, his fingers tracing the cold metal of the frame. He would check the pressure of each tire, moving in a slow, clockwise circle. He did this not out of paranoia, but out of a deep understanding of the world he lived in. Once he was on the road, the mundane stretch began. He would drive the same route from his home to his office, a journey of exactly 42 miles. He knew every pothole, every curve, and every police checkpoint along the way. He would keep his speed at exactly 60 miles per hour, never faster, never slower. He believed that the more predictable he was, the easier it would be to spot something that was out of place. It was a rhythmic, repetitive exercise in survival. He would spend his hours in meetings, reviewing financial ledgers, and reading reports about human rights abuses. He would drink small cups of strong, bitter coffee, the steam rising in front of his face as he stared at the mountains through his office window. He would answer dozens of phone calls, his voice always steady and professional, even when the person on the other end was crying or threatening him. He treated the chaos as if it were just another business problem. In the late afternoons, he would drive back. He liked the physical sensation of the steering wheel in his hands and the way the shadows of the mountains stretched across the road. He would listen to the local news on the radio, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. He would count the cars behind him, noting their colors and how long they stayed in his lane. He did this for years, 1,000 miles of mundane observation that had become as natural as breathing. He would arrive home, lock the gate, and spend 10 minutes sitting in his car with the engine off, just listening to the cooling metal click in the silence. He would then walk inside, kiss his wife, and wash his hands with a heavy, unscented soap. He would sit at the dinner table and talk about the price of cement or the weather, shielding his family from the dark data he had collected during the day. This was his life, a long, sustained effort to keep the darkness at bay. The subtle shift happened on that Sunday morning in October. Max Sharp was driving toward Nalchik to visit a relative. As he merged onto the federal highway, he noticed a black vehicle about 4 car lengths behind him. It wasn't an aggressive car. It didn't tailgate or try to pass. It just sat there, maintaining a perfect, static distance. But as Max Sharp increased his speed to 65, the black car increased its speed. When he slowed to 55, the black car slowed. He looked closer in his mirror and realized that the black vehicle had no license plates. In a region with a heavy police presence, a car without plates is a ghost. It shouldn't exist. He passed a security checkpoint, a place where he was usually stopped and searched, but today, the guards didn't even look up from their phones. They waved the silver Lada, and the plateless black ghost through without a single hesitation. The road ahead was suddenly, eerily empty. Max Sharp felt a cold, sharp prickle of electricity run down his spine. The air inside the cabin suddenly felt thin, and the smell of his own coffee in the cup holder became sickly sweet and cloying. He realized that the normalcy of the road had been an illusion. The empty highway and the silent checkpoint weren't a coincidence. They were a cleared stage. He gripped the steering wheel so hard the plastic groaned, his eyes fixed on the black shape in the mirror. You are Max Sharp Ashef. You are driving 60 miles per hour on a highway you have known your entire life. Your phone is on the passenger seat, but you know there is no one you can call who can reach you in time. The black car behind you has suddenly swerved into the left lane and is pulling up alongside you. You look over and you can't see the driver because the windows are too dark. You see a flash of light, and then the world explodes into a chaotic roar. The sound of automatic gunfire hitting the thin metal of your car sounds like 1,000 hammers hitting a tin roof all at once. The glass of your driver's side window shatters, and you feel the hot, stinging spray of crystals against your cheek. Your car begins to fishtail as the tires are shredded by lead. Do you slam on the brakes and try to run into the woods? Do you try to ram the other car? Or do you realize that this is the moment you always knew was coming? The silver Lada didn't stand a chance. Over 60 rounds of high-caliber ammunition were fired into the vehicle in less than 10 seconds. It was a surgical, professional application of violence. The car veered off the road, plowed through a shallow ditch, and came to a rest in a field of dry grass. The black car didn't stop to check the body. It simply accelerated, disappearing into the mountain mist, as if it had never been there at all. The bizarre reveal came when the investigators arrived on the scene. Despite the highway being a major transit route, there were no witnesses. More importantly, the high-definition security cameras at the checkpoint Moksharip had just passed were found to have malfunctioned at the exact moment of the shooting. The investigators didn't find a single shell casing on the road, suggesting the assassins had used brass catchers, a hallmark of elite state security units. The man who had spent years documenting the illegal abductions by the state had been eliminated by the very tactics he had exposed. His death followed a chilling pattern in the Caucasus, where activists and journalists were systematically removed from the board whenever their voices became too loud. Moksharip Ashev wasn't killed by a criminal gang. He was deleted by a system that viewed his integrity as a threat to its existence. He was a man who died for the truth. The assassination sparked protests across Ingushetia, but as with many such cases in Russia, no one was ever successfully prosecuted. The investigation was quietly closed a few years later due to lack of evidence. Moksharip's family was left with a silver Lada full of holes, and a hole in their lives that would never heal. He became a martyr for human rights, a reminder that in some parts of the world, the price of a conscience is paid in automatic gunfire. Moksharip Ashev lived his life with a code of honor that the men in the black car could never understand. He believed that even in the face of absolute darkness, one must continue to speak. He was a businessman who traded his safety for his principles, and he left behind a legacy that continues to inspire those who still fight for justice in the mountains. He was an anchor of normalcy who was finally pulled into the deep, dark water he had tried to navigate. But as the mountains of the Caucasus fell silent after the roar of gunfire, halfway across the world, another man of great wealth was facing a different kind of threat. Michael Greening was a British billionaire living on the sun-drenched island of Anguilla. He didn't have to worry about political assassins or state-sponsored ghosts. He lived in a paradise of turquoise water and white sand. He believed that his money and his island fortress made him untouchable. While Moksharip was killed for his voice, Michael Greening would be targeted for his wallet. The transition from the cold, political execution in Russia to the desperate, botched robbery in the Caribbean shows that whether you are in a war zone or a tropical paradise, the world can turn dark in an instant. We are moving from the high-altitude highway to the luxury villa by the sea. Let us head to Anguilla to see what happens when a billionaire's island keeps its secrets. The sound of the ocean at night on the island of Anguilla is not a peaceful melody. It is a relentless, rhythmic thrumming that seems to vibrate the very air inside your chest. It is the sound of thousands of tons of turquoise water slamming against the limestone cliffs, a deep and guttural roar followed by the long, hissing retreat of foam over jagged rocks. In the darkness, the water looks like a vast sheet of moving oil, reflecting nothing but the cold, distant light of the stars. If you stood on the balcony of a luxury villa, the air would feel like a warm, wet hand pressing against your face. It is a thick, humid atmosphere that carries the sharp, biting scent of sea salt and the faint, sweet aroma of jasmine flowers that only bloom after the sun goes down. The salt is everywhere. It settles on your skin, it coats the windows in a fine, white film, and it tastes like old metal when you breathe it in. It is a beautiful place, but the air feels heavy with secrets. Underneath the roar of the sea, there is a smaller, more domestic sound, the constant, hypnotic whirring of a heavy-duty ceiling fan. It spins in a slow, endless circle, its blades slicing through the humid air with a rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack that fills the silence of the hallways. Occasionally, a lizard will skitter across the stone tile, its claws making a dry, scratching noise that sounds far louder than it should. It is an environment where every tiny sound feels magnified. The man we are talking about was Michael Greening. He was 64 years old and lived the kind of life that most people only see in glossy travel magazines. He was a wealthy British expatriate who had spent 30 years building a successful business career in the United Kingdom. He was a man of high intelligence, refined taste, and a deep appreciation for the finer things. He had worked hard his entire life, and Anguilla was supposed to be his ultimate reward, his personal fortress of peace. Michael was a man of medium height, with silver hair and eyes that always seemed to be calculating the distance between 2 points. He carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who never had to worry about a bill or a mortgage again. He was well liked by the other expats on the island, known for his sharp wit and his generous hospitality. He spent his days swimming in his private pool, reading historical biographies, and planning elaborate dinners for his friends. He felt untouchable in his luxury villa. The house was built like a modern castle, with thick reinforced walls, state-of-the-art security cameras, and a perimeter fence that was monitored 24 hours a day. Michael believed that his money had bought him more than just a house. It had bought him safety from a world that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. He walked around his property barefoot, feeling the cool stone beneath his feet, convinced that the island was his sanctuary. Michael's nightly routine was a masterclass in the quiet, repetitive habits of a man who loved order. Every evening at exactly 6:30, as the sky turned a bruised shade of purple, he would walk through his entire house to perform what he called the lockdown. He started with the heavy mahogany front door, sliding the brass bolt into place with a satisfying metallic click. He would then check the handle twice, giving it a firm tug to ensure the latch had caught perfectly. He would then move to the kitchen, where he spent 10 minutes meticulously cleaning the granite countertops. He liked the physical sensation of the damp cloth moving in tight, circular motions, removing every trace of dust and salt. He would then check the gas valves on the stove, turning each knob to the left and then back to the center to make sure they were tight. He would do this for every single burner, a habit he had picked up decades ago and never managed to shake. Next was the security system. He would walk to the keypad near the master bedroom and enter his 6-digit code. He would wait for the small, high-pitched beep that signaled the sensors were active. He would then stand there for exactly 30 seconds, watching the green light pulse, ensuring that every window and door on his property was reporting as secure. He found a strange kind of comfort in that little green light. It was the digital guardian of his personal paradise. After the security check, he would make himself a small glass of expensive scotch, the ice cubes clinking against the crystal with a sharp, musical ring. He would take the drink out to the covered patio and sit in his favorite leather chair. He would spend an hour just staring at the ocean, listening to the waves, and counting the flashes of the distant lighthouse. He would sip the scotch slowly, letting the warmth settle in his throat, feeling completely and utterly at peace. Before going to bed, he would perform one final check of the pool lights. He would walk to the edge of the water, watching the blue glow illuminate the bottom of the pool. He would check the skimmer for leaves, his hands moving with the same practiced efficiency he used in his office in London. He would then lock the sliding glass doors, pull the heavy curtains shut, and turn off every light in the house except for a small lamp in the hallway. It was a perfect, mundane cycle. He had lived this way for years. Thousands of nights followed this exact pattern. He was the anchor of his own normalcy, a man who believed that if he followed the rules of his routine, the world outside his fence could never touch him. He saw himself as a ghost in a machine of his own making, a man who had successfully retired from the dangers of the real world. He went to sleep every night with a smile on his face, listening to the fan above his head, feeling safe. The subtle shift happened on a humid Tuesday in 2009. Michael was performing his nightly lockdown when he reached the sliding glass door leading to the patio. He went to slide the bolt, but his fingers hit something rough on the frame. He looked closer and saw a series of tiny, jagged scratches near the lock mechanism. They were so small, they were almost invisible, but to a man who lived by the logic of perfection, they were like a scream in a library. He paused, his heart giving a small, sharp thud against his ribs. He checked the security keypad, and the light was still green. Everything was supposed to be secure. He told himself it was just the salt air corroding the metal, or perhaps a lizard had gotten caught in the track. But as he stood there in the silence, he realized that the rhythmic sound of the ceiling fan was different. It wasn't thwack 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 anymore. It was thwack pause thwack. He looked up at the fan and realized it was vibrating more than usual, as if the weight of the blades had been slightly altered. He then noticed a faint, dark smudge on the white ceiling near the vent, a smudge that looked like the print of a rubber-soled shoe. His mouth went dry, and the taste of the sea salt became bitter. He didn't call the police. He didn't scream. He just stood there, paralyzed by the realization that his fortress had been breached without a sound. You are Michael Greening, and you are standing in your dark hallway. The only light comes from the small lamp at the other end of the house. You can hear your own heartbeat, a fast, frantic sound that echoes in your ears. You are holding a heavy crystal glass in your hand, but it feels like a toy against the silence of the room. You hear a sound coming from the master bedroom, the sound of a slow, deliberate breath that does not belong to you. It is the sound of a hunter. Your security system says the perimeter is clear, which means whoever is inside didn't come through a door or a window. They have been here for hours, waiting in the attic or the vents, watching you perform your little routine. They know your habits. They know where you keep your watch. Do you run for the front door, knowing it will take 10 seconds to unlock? Do you hide in the bathroom? Or do you realize that the money that bought this paradise also bought you a target? Michael Greening didn't have time to choose. As he turned toward the bedroom, a shadow detached itself from the darkness of the hallway. It was a fast, violent movement that ignored the refined logic of Michael's world. There was no conversation, no demand for money. There was only the sudden, cold reality of a struggle in a room that smelled of jasmine and sea salt. Michael's fortress of peace became his tomb in less than 60 seconds of chaotic, muffled violence. The bizarre reveal came when the local police finally arrived the next morning. They found the villa perfectly locked from the inside. The security system was still active, and the green light was still pulsing. But Michael was dead, and his safe was empty. The Island of Secrets lived up to its name as the investigation hit a wall of silence. The locals didn't talk to the police, and the police seemed strangely hesitant to push for answers in the expat community. It eventually came to light that Michael hadn't been targeted by a professional hit squad. He had been the victim of a local gang that had spent weeks watching him from the cliffs. They had realized that the rich foreigner followed such a predictable routine that they didn't even need to break a lock. They had entered the house through an unsecured roof vent while he was busy cleaning his kitchen, and they had simply waited for him to finish his nightly lockdown. The very routine that gave Michael a sense of safety was the roadmap the killers used to end his life. They knew exactly when he would be on the patio, exactly when he would be at the keypad, and exactly when he would be most vulnerable. The security system he trusted so much was useless because the threat was already inside the circle. His wealth had made him a target, and his predictable habits had made him a victim. He died in a paradise that had turned into a trap. The murder of Michael Greening remains one of the most contentious cases in Anguilla's history. It highlighted the deep security vulnerabilities of high-net-worth individuals living in developing nations where the police are often underfunded or compromised. Michael was a man of the world who believed he could buy a life without risk, only to find that the most dangerous thing you can have in a place with secrets is a routine that never changes. He was buried far from the turquoise water he loved, and his villa was eventually sold to another wealthy expat who likely installed even more cameras. But as the salt air continues to corrode the locks on that island fortress, thousands of miles away in the freezing winter of Finland, a very different kind of nightmare was about to unfold. On New Year's Eve, 2009, the safety of a modern European shopping mall was about to be shattered. While Michael Greening's death was a secret act of greed in a luxury villa, the tragedy in Helsinki would be a public act of rage in a place designed for celebration. We are moving from the warm, humid nights of the Caribbean to the cold, neon-lit aisles of a Finnish mall. The transition from the targeted robbery to a mass shooting shows that no matter how many locks you have or how many laws are in place, some people just want to watch the world burn. The air inside the Cello shopping mall in Espoo, Finland, on the final morning of 2009, did not smell like the frozen tundra waiting just outside the glass doors. It smelled like toasted cinnamon, expensive roasted coffee beans, and the faint, ozone-heavy scent of hundreds of high-definition television screens humming in unison. It was a sterile, warm, and comforting environment that made you forget that the sun had barely risen and would be gone again in just a few short hours. Beneath the cheerful holiday music playing over the speakers, there was the constant, rhythmic sound of thousands of rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished granite floors. It was a soft, shuffling noise that sounded like the tide coming in. If you stood near the main atrium, you could hear the distant, melodic chime of the escalators and the muffled laughter of families planning their New Year's Eve parties. It was a place that hummed with the energy of a million small, happy plans. The light was bright and artificial, a brilliant white that reflected off the chrome fixtures and glass storefronts until everything looked like it was made of diamonds. Occasionally, you would hear the sharp, mechanical clack of a cash drawer opening or the rhythmic beep of a barcode scanner. These were the sounds of a functioning, prosperous society. It was an atmosphere where you felt completely insulated from the darkness of the world, a climate-controlled sanctuary where nothing bad could ever happen. The people at the center of this story were the employees of the Prisma grocery store located inside the mall. They were men and women like 40-year-old Vesa or 27-year-old Maria, who viewed their jobs not just as a paycheck, but as a community. They were the kind of people who knew their regular customers' names and remembered which brand of bread they preferred. They were stable, hard-working Finns who took pride in the order and efficiency of their daily routines at the large mall. To their friends, they were the people who always showed up on time and never complained about the long shifts during the holiday rush. They had lives outside the mall, children waiting for them at home, dinners to cook, and New Year's resolutions to make. They were the anchors of their own small worlds, providing a sense of normalcy and safety to everyone around them. They carried themselves with a quiet, professional dignity, moving through the aisles with a sense of purpose and a friendly nod for everyone. They believed in the system. They lived in one of the safest countries on the entire planet, a place where the police were trusted and the laws were respected. They operated under the assumption that a restraining order was a physical barrier and that the social contract would protect them while they worked. They were the definition of ordinary people doing ordinary things in a world that rewarded their consistency. They had no reason to believe that the clock was ticking down to a total collapse of that safety. The morning of December 31st followed a mundane stretch that was as predictable as the ticking of a clock. It started with the rhythmic shur of the metal security shutters being raised at exactly 8 o'clock. The employees would spend the first hour of their shift walking through the long, quiet aisles, straightening the boxes of cereal and ensuring the labels on the milk cartons were all facing forward. They liked the physical sensation of the cold air coming off the dairy cases. They would move from one shelf to the next, their hands performing a choreographed dance of organization. They would check the expiration dates, their fingers moving with a practiced speed that came from years of repetition. There was a hypnotic quality to the work. They would scan a pallet of juice boxes, listen for the chirp of the handheld computer, and then move the heavy plastic into place. It was a sequence of small, manageable tasks that built a sense of accomplishment before the crowds arrived. By 10 o'clock, the store was full of shoppers. The employees settled into the repetitive rhythm of the checkout lanes. They would pick up an item, slide it across the red laser of the scanner, and listen for the ping. They did this thousands of times an hour. Ping, bag, ping, bag. It was a musical cadence that filled the air. They would exchange small, polite pleasantries with the customers, talking about the weather or the fireworks that would be launched at midnight that evening. They would take their scheduled 15-minute breaks in a small, windowless room in the back. They would sit on plastic chairs, drinking lukewarm coffee from paper cups and checking their phones. They would talk about their plans for the evening, laughing about who was going to stay up late and who was going to fall asleep before the countdown. Then, they would stand up, adjust their uniforms, and go back out to the floor to start the cycle over again. It was a day like 10,000 other days. The subtle shift happened at exactly 10 o'clock and 8 minutes. A man named Ibrahim Shkupoli walked through the main entrance of the Cello Mall. He wasn't carrying shopping bags, and he didn't look like someone who was there to celebrate. He moved with a stiff, mechanical gait that was completely out of sync with the relaxed, festive atmosphere of the crowd. He was dressed in dark clothing that looked too heavy for the warm interior of the mall, and he kept his chin tucked low. As he walked past the fountain in the center of the atrium, he didn't look at the lights or the decorations. He didn't stop to look at a map. He moved with a terrifying, singular focus, as if he were being pulled toward the Prisma store by an invisible wire. People noticed him, not because he was being loud, but because he was so unnervingly silent. He didn't blink, and his hands were buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, gripping something that made the fabric bulge in a jagged way. He reached the entrance of the grocery store and stopped. He didn't look at the special offers or the rows of fruit. He looked directly at the employees working the registers. There was a coldness in his eyes that seemed to lower the temperature of the room by 20 degrees. He wasn't a shopper. He was a hunter who had already found his prey. He stepped over the invisible threshold of the store, and for a heartbeat, the holiday music seemed to fade into a distorted, low-frequency hum. You are Maria, standing at register 4. You have just scanned a bag of potatoes, and you are reaching for a carton of eggs. The mall is loud, filled with the sounds of 1,000 conversations, but suddenly you hear a sound that cuts through everything. It is a sharp, metallic crack, followed by a high-pitched whiz that you feel more than hear. You look up and see a man standing 10 feet away, holding a black 9mm handgun with both hands. He is moving toward you. The world suddenly slows down until you can see the individual sparks flying from the barrel of the gun. Your heart is slamming against your ribs so hard it feels like it might break them. You look at the emergency exit, but it feels like it is a mile away. People are screaming, but the sound is muffled, like you are underwater. Do you dive behind the counter and hope the plastic protects you? Do you run for the back room? Or do you freeze, paralyzed by the realization that the mall is no longer safe? Ibrahim Shkapoli didn't stop at one person. He moved through the store with a cold, calculated efficiency that suggested he had planned this for weeks. He targeted specific employees, people he had known through his ex-girlfriend. He fired with a steady hand, ignoring the hundreds of terrified shoppers who were trampling each other to reach the exits. He wasn't there for the money, and he wasn't there for a political cause. He was there to settle a perceived debt of honor with blood. The bizarre reveal came when the police entered his ex-girlfriend's apartment later that afternoon. They found her body first. Shkupoli had murdered her in cold blood hours before he ever set foot in the mall. She had a restraining order against him, a piece of paper that was supposed to keep him at least 500 feet away at all times. But the investigation revealed that Shkupoli had been tracking her for months, using a complex system of GPS devices and social media monitoring. He had turned his obsession into a tactical operation. The restraining order hadn't stopped him. It had simply forced him to become more secretive and more lethal. He had gathered his weapons illegally and had even practiced his shooting in the woods outside the city. He viewed the massacre not as a crime, but as a necessary conclusion to his relationship. He then fled the mall and took his own life, leaving the authorities with a pile of bodies and a mountain of questions about how he was allowed to stay in the country. The Selo Mall shooting remains one of Finland's deadliest incidents, a tragedy that shattered the nation's sense of absolute security. It proved that even in a society with strict gun laws and a high level of trust, a single individual fueled by rage and obsession can dismantle the peace in a matter of minutes. The Prisma store eventually reopened, but the ping of the scanners and the beep of the registers would never sound the same to the people who survived that morning in 2009. The employees who went to work that day, expecting a celebration, instead found themselves in a war zone. They were ordinary people who were forced to confront an extraordinary darkness. The names of the victims are etched into a small plaque near the entrance of the mall, a quiet reminder that safety is a fragile thing that must be guarded with more than just paper orders. The New Year's Eve fireworks that year were canceled, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than the Finnish winter. As the snow fell over the memorial in Espoo, 10,000 miles away in the humid, neon-drenched streets of Bangkok, Thailand, a very different kind of execution was being prepared. In a luxury hotel room, a wealthy businessman was sitting down for a drink with a woman he had met online. He didn't have to worry about gunmen in a shopping mall, and he felt completely in control of his evening. He believed that his money and his status made him the predator in this particular game. While the tragedy in Finland was a public explosion of violence, the event in Thailand would be a silent, chemical betrayal. The transition from the roar of a 9mm handgun to the sweet, lethal taste of a blue juice shows that the end can come in many forms. Sometimes it is loud and sudden, and sometimes it is a quiet fade into a sleep from which you never wake up. Let us head to the heat of Bangkok to see what happens when a honey trap is set with a lethal dose. The air inside a luxury hotel suite in the heart of Bangkok does not smell like the humid, exhaust-choked streets just 20 stories below. It smells like a sterile, expensive blend of high-end sandalwood candles, chilled ozone from a heavy-duty air conditioning unit, and the faint, sweet tang of a freshly sliced pineapple sitting on a silver tray. It is an atmosphere of curated perfection, where every surface is polished to a mirror shine, and the outside world feels like a distant, irrelevant memory. Underneath the low, constant hum of the ventilation system, There is a smaller, more intimate sound, the rhythmic, crystalline clinking of ice cubes hitting the side of a heavy tumbler. It is a sharp, musical noise that echoes off the marble countertops. If you were standing in that room, you would feel the slight vibration of the city's SkyTrain passing nearby. But here, it is reduced to a gentle, hypnotic thrum that only adds to the sense of exclusive, high-altitude luxury. There is a specific color that dominates the room on this night. A deep, unnerving shade of electric blue sitting in a tall glass. It is a vibrant, neon liquid that looks more like a chemical from a laboratory than a health drink. The light from the city below catches the condensation on the glass, making it glow with a sickly brilliance. It is a sensory world that promises relaxation and health, but there is an underlying chemical sharpness to the air that suggests something is not quite right. The man sitting in that room was a 48-year-old businessman we will call Somchai. To his employees at his logistics firm, Somchai was a man of absolute control and unwavering logic. He was wealthy, sophisticated, and possessed a sharp eye for detail that had made him a multimillionaire by the age of 40. He was a man who didn't take risks. He calculated them. He lived in a world of contracts, spreadsheets, and firm handshakes, and he believed he could read people with a single glance. To his friends, Somchai was a connoisseur of the good life. He wore watches that cost more than a luxury sedan and stayed in hotels that required a private elevator. He was a man who valued his privacy and his status above all else. He carried himself with a quiet, relaxed authority, convinced that his wealth acted as a shield against the common dangers of the world. He was the anchor of his own normalcy, a man who felt he was always the smartest person in the room, no matter where he was. He was a creature of habit who enjoyed the ritual of the chase. He had recently started using high-end online dating apps to meet younger women, viewing it as just another transaction in his very busy and successful life. He believed he was the one in control, the benefactor who set the rules and the pace. He was a man who trusted his instincts because they had never failed him in business. He had no idea that those same instincts were about to lead him directly into a lethal chemical trap. Somchai's routine for a high-end date was a masterclass in repetitive, mundane preparation. Every Friday evening at exactly 5 o'clock, he would leave his office and drive his silver Mercedes to his favorite boutique hotel. He liked the physical sensation of handing his keys to the valet, a gesture of power that he performed with a practiced, effortless flick of the wrist. He would then spend 10 minutes in the lobby, checking his reflection in the gold-trimmed mirrors to ensure his suit was perfect. Once inside his suite, he would perform a ritual he called the audit. He would walk through the room, checking the seals on the minibar bottles and ensuring the towels were folded in the specific way he preferred. He would spend 15 minutes organizing his personal items on the desk, his phone, his wallet, and his spare watch, placing them in a perfectly straight line. He liked the order. He believed that if his environment was perfectly controlled, then nothing unexpected could ever happen. He would then spend 30 minutes on his phone, scrolling through the profiles of the women he had met online. He would read their messages with a critical eye, looking for inconsistencies or red flags that might suggest they were after more than just a dinner date. He would reply with short, professional sentences, setting a meeting time of exactly 8 o'clock. He enjoyed the repetition of the digital flirtation, the predictable back and forth that preceded the actual encounter in the hotel. When the woman arrived, the mundane stretch continued with a rehearsed conversation. He would order room service, always a bottle of high-end sparkling water and a platter of fresh fruit. He would sit in the same leather armchair and ask the same sequence of questions about her background, her education, and her interests. He would watch her body language, listening for the cadence of her voice, convinced that he was performing a deep psychological evaluation while they talked. He would spend 2 hours in this state of relaxed observation, nodding at the right times and offering small, polite compliments. He found a strange kind of peace in the predictability of the night. It was a sequence of events he had lived through dozens of times before. He believed he was the director of the scene, and that the woman across from him was simply following his lead. He was an anchor of normalcy, coasting through a life where every interaction was a calculated success. This was his life for years. He had hundreds of these dates, and they all followed the same boring, comfortable script. He was a master of the mundane, a champion of the controlled environment. He believed that as long as he stayed within the walls of a five-star hotel and followed his checklist, he was safe from the chaos of the Bangkok streets. He went into every date with a sense of invulnerability, thinking that he was the predator and the world was his playground. The subtle shift happened on a humid Thursday in 2009. Somchai was sitting with a woman he had met only 2 hours prior. She was beautiful, soft-spoken, and seemed perfectly aligned with his expectations. But halfway through their conversation, she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a tall, slender bottle. It was filled with an electric blue liquid. She told him it was a special health juice from a private clinic, designed to boost energy and clarity. She didn't just offer him a drink, she insisted on it. She spoke about the ingredients with a technical, rehearsed precision that appealed to Somchai's love of data. She poured the liquid into a clean glass, and the neon blue color vibrated against the white marble table. Somchai noticed that the smell of the room had changed. The sweet scent of the pineapple was now overshadowed by a sharp, medicinal odor that reminded him of a dentist's office. It was a tiny, jagged detail. He hesitated for a second, his instincts giving a small, sharp tug at the back of his mind. He looked at the glass, and then back at the woman's smiling face. She looked so innocent, so focused on his well-being. He told himself he was being paranoid, that this was just a modern health trend he wasn't familiar with. He didn't want to seem old or out of touch. He picked up the glass, feeling the cold condensation against his palm, and took a long, steady sip of the blue juice. "You are Somchai, and you are sitting in your favorite leather chair. You have just swallowed the last of the blue liquid, and for a few seconds, you feel a strange cold rush in your throat. You go to say something to the woman, but you realize that your tongue feels like a heavy piece of wet velvet in your mouth. You try to lift your hand to adjust your watch, but your arm doesn't move. It feels like it is made of lead, pinned to the armrest by an invisible force. The room starts to tilt at a 45-degree angle. The city lights outside the window are no longer distinct points. They are long, shimmering ribbons of white and yellow. You can hear your heart beating, but it sounds slow and muffled, like a drum being played deep underwater. You look at the woman, and she isn't smiling anymore. She is standing up, calmly putting on a pair of latex gloves. Do you try to scream? Do you try to reach for your phone? Or do you realize that your audit failed? Somchai didn't have time to fight. The sedative in the blue juice was a powerful, unregulated pharmaceutical cocktail designed to induce total paralysis in seconds. He was still conscious, his eyes wide and staring, but his body had become a cage. He watched as the woman moved around the room with the efficiency of a professional athlete. She didn't look for money in his wallet. She went straight for his safe and the heavy Rolex on his frozen wrist. He was a spectator at his own robbery. The bizarre reveal came when the police discovered Somchai's body the following morning. He wasn't just unconscious, he was dead. The honey trap ring that had targeted him had been operating in Bangkok for months, using the blue juice as their signature weapon. But in Somchai's case, they had made a fatal calculation error. They had used a dosage intended for a much larger man, and the mixture had interacted with a heart medication Somchai hadn't mentioned. The health juice wasn't a sedative. It was a lethal poison because of a simple decimal point error in a clandestine lab. The investigation into his death led to a massive crackdown on unregulated escort sites and sugar daddy apps across Thailand. The police found that Somchai was just one of 12 victims, though he was the only one who didn't wake up. The woman he met was part of a highly organized criminal syndicate that viewed wealthy men as nothing more than ATMs to be emptied. Somchai spent his life trying to be the smartest, most controlled person in the room. He built a fortress of wealth and routine to protect himself, but he was undone by a single sip of a blue liquid. He believed he was the one setting the trap, but he was actually the one walking into it. He was a man of logic who was killed by a chemical mistake, a businessman whose final transaction was his own life. He died in a 5-star room, surrounded by the luxury he thought would save him. The case of the blue juice poisoning remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of the digital age, where the strange, dark, and mysterious can be delivered in a tall glass by someone with a beautiful smile. Somchai's story is a warning about the limits of control and the hidden risks that exist even in the most curated lives. He was an anchor of normalcy who was finally pulled under by a current he never saw coming, leaving behind a legacy of caution for a city that never sleeps. With that, we have come to the end of our journey through the 11 stories of 2009. We have traveled from the cartels of Mexico to the internet cafes of Tokyo, and from the cold lakes of England to the neon streets of Bangkok. Each story has shown us a different way that the world can turn dark, and how the people caught in those shadows were often just like you and me, ordinary people who encountered something they never could have prepared for. If you enjoyed these stories, and you've made it this far, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We truly appreciate the support, and we love seeing your comments about where you're listening from. It helps us keep telling these stories of the strange, dark, and mysterious. Until next time, I'm Mr. Balin, and I'll see you in the next case. Take care of yourselves out there, because you never know what's waiting just around the corner or inside that next room.